because I have issues with both the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Hi, I'm Pastor Frankie Leggett III, and welcome to the Crossroads podcast, where religion and politics collide. It was November 8th, 1960. I was playing in the front yard of my aunt and uncle's house on West State Street in my hometown of Trenton, New Jersey. I was 7 years of age. Now, I had seen the posters up and down the street, but I really didn't understand what was going on. And now, as I recollect, I distinctly remember a Kennedy sign in the front yard of my aunt and uncle's house. While playing in the front yard of the house on election day in 1960, my Uncle Richard comes out of the house and is walking towards the gate to go to his car. And quite the inquisitive one, I asked my uncle, Uncle Richard, where are you going? He responded, to vote. I asked, who are you going to vote for? He said, one word, Kennedy. Now, I really didn't understand the implication of all that was going on politically at the time, but I did know that we were in an election season. I also knew that Nixon and Kennedy were the two candidates who were vying for the presidency. But prior to that moment, I had no rooting interest. I had no dog in the fight. I knew nothing about Democrats or Republicans. I was 7 years of age. That notwithstanding, when my Uncle Richard declared that he was voting for John F. Kennedy, that's all I needed to know. You see, Uncle Richard was one of the most important role models in my life. I loved him dearly. And if he was a Democrat, it had to be a good thing. That instant, a seed was planted in me. It was a Democratic seed, although I was still too young to understand what that meant. Fast forward a couple of years. I was in the 5th grade when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I observed how the African American community reacted to his death. It was almost like someone had died in the family. And even though I'm still young, I'm about 10 years of age at this point, I was moved by that. We were living in the projects at the time, and it felt as if the hopes of the race had been dashed forever. Now, I was in a year later, I'm in the 6th grade, when Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee from Arizona, ran against President Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president in the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination. And it's around this time that things begin to crystallize politically for me. And I understood, although I was about 10 years of age, that Goldwater did not represent my people or our interests. Therefore, I rooted for Johnson to win in 1964. My political worldview was beginning to take shape. It was President Johnson that would become the single most consequential president of my lifetime for my people and myself, and here's why. July 2nd, 1964, it was President Lyndon B. Johnson, who signed into law the much needed and much fought for Civil Rights Act. July 30, a year later, 1965, President Johnson signed legislation creating Medicare and Medicaid. August 6, just a week later, he signed the Voting Rights Act into law also in 1965. 1 year later, June 13, 2 years later, June 13, 1967, President Johnson nominates the very first African American as an associate Supreme Court justice. And on October 2nd, 1967, Thurgood Marshall becomes the 96th justice of the Supreme Court. And then 1 year later, April 11, 1968, with President Johnson's leadership in the matter, the Federal Housing Act is passed. Just 1 week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Notwithstanding the tremendous advantages of the Johnson administration, as a teenager, I was now keenly aware of the racial division that existed in America. I perceived that my heroes, those who fought for my people, were all on the left and were Democrats, while those who opposed integration and the upliftment of my people were all on the right and were Republicans. As I entered my 20s and I transitioned into my 30s, those who thought like me or who fought for me, I perceived, were Democrats. My family members were all Democrats. Therefore, when I began to vote, I voted Democrat. It remained that way until the year 2020, 4 years ago. I was presenting a series of messages during the Seventh-day Adventist camp meeting, which is an annual event, June and July of every year, when in that very first presentation, I referred to the Trump supporters in the House and Senate like Lindsey Graham, Jim Jordan, Mitch McConnell, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and others as sycophants and flunkies and wimps. And after that broadcast aired, later that morning, I received a phone call from a high-ranking official in my conference that people had called in and complained about the message. And so I'm going to assume, and I think rightly so, that the complainers were Republicans, African-American Republicans, who were incensed at my description of their politicians. I was completely caught off guard. I was not the first to use that language to describe those individuals, and I certainly will not be the last. So, being compliant, like as I am, I volunteered to re-record that session, but it was made clear to me that the additional 4 presentations would be scrutinized to ensure that they were not offensive. In the process, I was chastised. But I admit I deserved it. And looking back on that situation, I can admit that my choice of words were not appropriate given the context. Notwithstanding that admission, the situation changed me forever. I learned a valuable lesson that day that I shall never forget. I learned that just as passionate and protective as I was and had been for Democrats, there are African Americans who are as passionate and as protective of Republicans. Moreover, I had two subsequent conversations with individuals from the church that I'm pastoring, and they informed me that my sermons on these political issues were hurtful to the Republicans in my congregation. Consequently, I've learned the hard way that African Americans and people of African descent are not a monolith. That many are Republicans and protective of their political candidates. This epiphany has pushed me from the left towards the center. I am now a registered independent. Why? Because I have issues with both the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. And I've concluded that I must be free to be able to criticize both parties indiscriminately without being viewed as a Democratic partisan. That is a most important development for me. And I want it to be known that as an independent, that I don't have a dog in either fight, left or right, Democrat or Republican. And as a pastor and as an advocate for right, justice, and change, I must be free to criticize both, which I have done even of the Democratic Party for 4 decades, even prior to my change. And while I identify as an independent, I consider myself to be a left-leaning, progressive on some issues, moderate, who prefers to be somewhere in the middle politically on many, if not most, issues. And with each of my successive podcasts, my views, I believe, will reflect that viewpoint. And so I like where I am now. I'm not beholden to either party. There are things I identify with in the Democratic Party, and there are a few things that I identify with in the Republican Party. For instance, I am pro-life, and I have always been pro-life. However, I do believe that there must be exceptions to that rule. You see, when a young girl or woman has been the victim of incest, there must be an exception to the Dobbs rule. When a woman has been raped or sexually abused and gets pregnant as a result, there must be an exception to the abortion rule. When a mother is about to give birth and the pregnancy places her life in jeopardy, there must be an exception to that rule. And forcing a 12-year-old young girl to go to another state after having been sexually abused is inherently immoral. And refusing health care to a woman that is bleeding incessantly is equally abhorrent and wrong. We as a people, and especially those in the church, must have compassion on people. And when women's lives are literally in the balance and we are not moved to compassion by that, we are not Christian and we are not Christ-like. I don't care how often you go to and stay in church. Republicans claim that they are the party of family values, and yet in the instances above, they have zero compassion and sensitivity. They would go as far as imprisoning the doctors who are trying to save the lives of women who are bleeding incessantly and their lives are in the balance. Republicans have far more compassion and protection in place for the unborn child than they do for children after they are born into the world. That, ladies and gentlemen, is ridiculous. Now, there's a young lady who expressed the Republicans' hypocrisy far better than I ever could when she said this about Republicans and their treatment of children before and after birth. Take a look at this clip.
Republicans aren't pro-children, they're pro-birth. Once that baby is in utero, they don't care if you have health care. What do they care about prenatal care? They don't. And once that baby's born, they don't want that baby to be on welfare. They don't want that baby to have access to health care. And when that kid's in school, they don't want them to have access to free food. They don't want there to be government-sponsored maternity and paternity leave. They don't want there to be government-sponsored daycare facilities so that we can have a better daycare program here in the United States. They don't do anything to extend the lives of children. They don't do anything to make the lives of children better. They don't care about kids. What they care about is controlling women. And that's it. That's what they care about. They care about controlling women.
I couldn't have said it better if I tried. So, Republicans claim that they are the party of family values, and yet they fight like crazy to keep African American families from voting merely because Republicans are convinced that when everyone votes, Republicans lose. That is a fact of life. And let's be clear. The primary demographics that Republicans want to prevent from voting are Black and brown people, not white people for the most part. Republicans have been found guilty in a court of law of voter suppression. In fact, Republican state legislatures all over the country have passed nearly 100 repressive voter restriction laws, all since 2014 and 2015. Republicans claim that they are the party of law and order. They claim that they support the blue. They declare that blue lives matter. And yet, when MAGA maniacs ransacked the Capitol on January 6th, they attacked, they pummeled, and they beat police officers to death. Check out this video. And so you see that notwithstanding that former President Trump and his cronies on Fox News said that January 6th was a peaceful protest, you saw that it was anything but peaceful. It was criminal. And all of them should go to jail for attempting a coup d'etat in broad daylight. And Donald Trump sent them there to do exactly that. Officer Brian Sicknick died the very next day. And then within a couple of months, 3 or 4 more officers died within the next couple of months. A couple of them committed suicide because, excuse me, they could not wrap their brains around the fact that their own countrymen and women could treat them as if they were enemy combatants. The MAGA insurrectionists acted as if they were on a battlefield fighting to protect America and Americans from foreign invaders. And then MAGA and MAGA networks like Fox and OAN and Newsmax, they cherry pick certain clips from that day and declare that it was a peaceful protest. What liars! And many of the MAGA crowd is made up of evangelical Christians who perpetuate that very same lie. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a lie from the pit of hell, as a friend would often say. It is a lie. MAGA is a dangerous movement, and I am fully convinced that no Christian, notwithstanding your denominational affiliation, should align itself with a political party that reminds us of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. No Christian should join a party who reminds us of such heinous acts and behaviors. Now, to be fair, Democrats don't get a pass either. While I'm never in favor of banning history books that depicts and teaches students about America's original sin, which is slavery, I am in favor of banning sexually explicit books that are required reading and that are also in the school libraries of our schools all across America. I am in favor of banning those books. Why? Because I believe that sex education should be left to parents and not to the government. Parents are the best arbiters as to when their children are mature enough to handle sexually explicit material. Not the government, not school systems. And just for the record, I believe and teach that a marriage constitutes a relationship between a man and a woman. And no, I am not homophobic. Having said that, however, because God has given us free will and the ability to choose our own destinies, people have the right to choose who to marry, who to sleep with, and who to love. God has given mankind that right. And so people have the right to choose. And one thing that has many people freaked out, especially in public schools, is the transgender school bathroom shower phenomenon. I've come to believe that there are some Democrats who are in favor of like co-ed bathrooms, where transgendered kids can go into the bathrooms and the showers of children of the opposite sex from that which they were born. Now, I personally believe that a child should attend the bathroom and the shower that is consistent with their gender at birth. And I have granddaughters, and I do not want males in the bathrooms and in the showers with my granddaughters. I do not. That doesn't make me homophobic. It makes me a concerned grandfather. But we're headed for real murky waters here, ladies and gentlemen. And I truly pray that we will survive. But I do fear that our political divide will destroy America as we know it, and we are on the clock. Here's why. Speaking of a movement in the last days, the Bible says this about a movement that will appear at the end of time. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9, 10, and 11 says this. This man will come to do the work of Satan with counterfeit power and signs and miracles. Verse 10. He will use every kind of evil deception to fool those on their way to destruction because they refuse to love and accept the truth that would save them. Verse 11, so God will cause them to be greatly deceived, and they will believe these lies. Did you hear that? Scripture prophesied almost 2,000 years ago that the day would come in this world where truth would be ignored and abhorred by many. And because people will prefer to be lied to, a leader would emerge in this country that would be an inveterate liar and deceiver and would lead people down a path that they would never recover from. But the prophecy doesn't end there. Check out these next several verses. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4 says this. For a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires and will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. Verse 4. They will reject the truth and will chase after myths. Ladies and gentlemen, does this sound like Trump, MAGA, the Republican Party, Fox News, One America Network, and what's the other ultra right wing network? I'm forgetting the Newsmax. It is a perfect description of what's going on with all of them. In particular, not that folk on the left don't have issues, because they do. But hating truth and rejecting truth is so prominent in right-wing circles that this text jumps out at you and screams at you that this is describing what's happening in this country and in other parts of the world, particularly in this country on the right. My prayer is that somehow, some way, our politics will return to a time in the era when politicians put country over party, like during the Watergate investigation, when Republican Senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, went to the White House and told Nixon that he was going to be impeached if he did not resign. And around the very same time, Nixon received a letter from the head of the Republican National Committee, George H.W. Bush, who ultimately became president of the United States of America a little later. So Bush sent him a letter also indicating that Nixon needed to resign. And the very next day, around noon, President Nixon resigned his post as president of the United States of America, and Gerald Ford was sworn in as the new president. And my point is this. In that whole Watergate episode, which I watched on a daily basis, politicians, both Democrat and Republican, put country above party. And they made a decision as to what was best for the country, not what was best for their party and for their political colleague. And so as I close, I'm asking that you would pray with me that some semblance of unity becomes a reality in the near future. If you like this content, please like and subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And before I close, I want to thank my producer extraordinaire, Lorraine Edwards, for an outstanding job of producing behind the scenes. I couldn't do this without my incredible friend. Thanks, Lorraine. And until next time, be blessed. I'll see you then.